There are people in this world who can walk into a room and instantly feel the tension no one is talking about. They notice the silence behind forced smiles. They hear pain hidden inside ordinary conversations. They sense rejection before a word is spoken. And most people call this a gift. But what if it was never a gift to begin with? What if it was survival? What if the child who became deeply empathetic was simply the child who had to become emotionally alert in order to stay safe? Because many sensitive people were not raised in environments where they could simply relax into childhood. They grew up reading moods like weather reports, studying facial expressions, listening carefully to footsteps, learning the difference between a dangerous silence and a peaceful one. Some children learn very early that love could disappear without warning, that affection could turn cold overnight, that anger could enter the room like a storm, and so they adapted. Not consciously, not strategic. Why not, but biologically? Their nervous systems became trained to scan constantly for emotional danger. They became experts at noticing what other people needed before anyone had to say it aloud. Not because they were born saints, but because their safety depended on it. A child who must constantly monitor a parent's emotions does not grow up feeling secure. That child grows up hyper-aware, and hyper-awareness often gets mistaken for empathy. The little girl who comforted everyone in the house was not necessarily mature beyond her years. She may have simply learned that her own feelings were inconvenient, so she became useful instead. The little boy who became the peacemaker was not necessarily naturally selfless. He may have learned that conflict was dangerous, so he devoted himself to keeping everyone emotionally stable. Many empaths were children who discovered that attunement was protection. If they could predict emotional shifts fast enough, maybe they could avoid pain. Maybe they could prevent rejection. Maybe they could earn love. And so they became shapeshifters. They learned to become who others needed them to be: easygoing, helpful, quiet, understanding, emotionally available, while their own inner world slowly disappeared into the background. Because when a child learns that authenticity threatens connection, the child abandons authenticity, not because they are weak, because attachment is survival. No child can survive emotionally without connection. So the child sacrifices a self to preserve the bond. And years later, the adult is praised for being so empathetic while secretly carrying exhaustion no one sees. Because constantly feeling everyone else's emotions is not peace, it is vigilance. Many empaths are not deeply connected to others because they are spiritually evolved. Many are deeply connected to others because they had no choice. They learned to read microexpressions because unpredictability terrified them. They learned to absorb emotional energy. Jai because boundaries were never safe. They learned to overgive because receiving felt uncomfortable. And eventually they forgot where other people ended and they began. That is the tragedy hidden beneath excessive empathy. A person can become so attuned to everyone else that they lose access to themselves completely. They know when someone else is hurting before that person even speaks. But they cannot recognize their own burnout until their body collapses. They know how to comfort everyone around them. But when they cry alone at night, they feel guilty for needing comfort too. Because somewhere deep inside they learned a dangerous belief. My worth is in how much I can carry for others. And so they carry conversations, they carry relationships, they carry wounded partners, they carry emotionally unavailable parents, they carry broken friendships, they carry everyone, while silently wondering why no one ever truly sees them, because the empath often becomes invisible eye. Inside their own empathy, people become addicted to their emotional labor, to their listening, to their patience, to their understanding, but very few stop to ask the empath one simple question: who takes care of you? And the painful truth is many empaths do not even know how to answer that question, because they were trained to believe that their needs were too much, too emotional, too inconvenient, too sensitive. So they became the caretaker instead, the strong one, the understanding one, the safe one. But underneath that role is often a deeply wounded nervous system still waiting for permission to rest, still waiting for someone to say, "You do not have to earn love by suffering." Many empaths confuse emotional self-abandonment with compassion. They stay too long in painful relationships because they understand the other person's trauma. They tolerate disrespect because they can see the wounded child behind destructive behavior. They excuse emotional neglect because they fear being misunderstood themselves. And in trying to save others, they slowly disappear. Because empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. The world praises people who endlessly give, but it rarely asks what happened to them that made them believe they had to. A deeply empathetic person is often carrying grief that has never been spoken aloud. The grief of never feeling fully protected. The grief of becoming emotionally responsible too young. The grief of learning to read everyone else while no one learned to read them. And perhaps the deepest grief of all, the realization that the personality they built for survival became mistaken for who they truly are. But survival is not identity. Hypervigilance is not love. Self-erasure is not kindness. Constant emotional exhaustion is not compassion. Real compassion includes the self. And healing begins the moment an empath understands this. The ability to feel deeply was never the problem. The problem was believing they were only valuable when they ignored themselves. Because the child who became emotionally hyper-aware was not weak. That child was adaptive, brilliantly adaptive. But survival strategies that protect us in childhood can imprison us in adulthood. The empath who once learned to scan every room for danger now struggles to relax even in safe relationships. The person who once survived by pleasing others now feels intense guilt when saying no. The child who became emotionally responsible for everyone now carries anxiety whenever someone is disappointed. Their nervous system still believes connection must be earned through sacrifice, and that belief quietly shapes entire lives. It creates adults who apologize for existing, adults who over-explain, adults who fear conflict more than loneliness, adults who confuse being needed with being loved. And beneath all of it is a silent question they have carried since childhood. If I stop taking care of everyone else, will anyone still choose me? There are wounds in this world, RLD, that never bleed in public. No one sees them, no one rushes to heal them, no one even knows they exist, because some people learned very early how to suffer quietly. They became masters of smiling while breaking inside, experts at saying I'm fine with tears trapped behind their eyes. They learned how to function while emotionally starving, how to comfort others while silently collapsing themselves. And the most dangerous pain is often the pain that never finds a voice. Many deeply sensitive people were not taught how to express pain safely. They were taught how to hide it. Maybe they grew up in homes where emotions made others uncomfortable, where sadness was weakness, where anger was disrespect, where vulnerability was ignored, mocked, or punished, so they adapted. The child who was never emotionally held learns to hold everything alone. The child who was not listened to eventually stops speaking. The child whose tears changed nothing learns to cry in silence. And over time, Chanel suppression stops feeling like suppression. It becomes personality. People start calling them strong, calm, wise, mature, but often what they are witnessing is not peace, it is emotional exile. Because when someone disconnects from their own pain long enough, they also disconnect from parts of themselves that needed love the most. Many empaths know exactly how to sit with another person's grief. They know how to offer warmth, presence, compassion, understanding. But when pain rises inside their own chest, they become uncomfortable, ashamed, restless, almost guilty for having needs at all. Because somewhere in their conditioning, they absorbed a devastating message. Other people's emotions matter more than yours, so they became emotionally available to everyone except themselves. They learned how to abandon themselves before anyone else had the chance to. And this creates invisible wounds that slowly shape an entire life. The wound of never feeling emotionally safe in you. To be honest. The wound of carrying sadness with no witness. The wound of becoming everyone's refuge while having nowhere to rest yourself. Some people suppress pain so deeply that they no longer recognize it emotionally. Their body carries it instead. The anxiety no one understands, the chronic exhaustion, the tight chest, the panic attacks, the insomnia, the unexplained heaviness they drag through ordinary days. The body remembers what the mind had to bury to survive. Because emotions do not disappear when ignored, they relocate. Unspoken grief settles into the nervous system. Silenced anger hardens into tension. Loneliness becomes numbness, and years of self-suppression slowly disconnect a person from their own aliveness. Many empaths become so focused on understanding others that they stop asking themselves a terrifyingly simple question. What do I feel? Not what others feel. Not what others need. Not what would keep the peace, but what is happening inside them. And for many, the answer is silence, not because nothing is there, because too much is there. A lifetime of unmet grief, unspoken resentment, invisible disappointments, loneliness hidden beneath usefulness, pain buried beneath responsibility. Some people became emotionally intelligent because they had to survive emotionally immature environments. But survival and healing are not the same thing. A person can become incredibly skilled at reading others while remaining completely disconnected from themselves. That is the hidden tragedy of emotional suppression. The world often rewards people for betraying themselves quietly. The person who never complains is admired. The person who tolerates everything is praised. The person who endlessly gives without asking for anything back is called good. But no one sees the internal cost. No one sees the nights spent emotionally drowning in silence, the private breakdowns, the ache of feeling unseen even while constantly showing up for others. Because suppressed. Pain does not disappear. It waits. It waits in the body, in relationships, in loneliness, in emotional reactions that seem too intense for the moment because they are carrying years beneath them. Sometimes a small disappointment suddenly breaks someone apart, not because the moment itself is unbearable, but because it touched every previous wound that was never allowed to speak. And sensitive people often become experts at minimizing their own suffering. There are people who have it worse. I shouldn't feel this way. I'm too emotional. I just need to be stronger. So they invalidate themselves before anyone else can. And eventually they become strangers to their own pain. But pain that is denied does not become smaller. It becomes lonely. There are people walking through life today carrying decades of emotional weight behind polite smiles. People who learned to perform wellness while silently falling apart. People who became caretakers because nobody cared for them emotionally. People who learned to disappear inside service, kindness, and understanding because they believed their value depended on how little space they occupied. And underneath that endless giving is often a human being starving for permission to simply exist without performing strength, to say, I am tired, I am hurting, I need help too. But many empaths fear their own emotions because they spent years containing everyone else's. They fear anger because anger once threatened connection. They fear sadness because sadness once received no comfort. They fear vulnerability because vulnerability once led to rejection. So they suppress, contain, endure, absorb, until one day they wake up emotionally numb, unable to recognize themselves anymore. Because suppression does not only bury pain, it buries joy, desire, creativity, authenticity, vitality. A person cannot selectively numb emotion. When we shut down grief, we eventually shut down aliveness too. And many empaths have spent so long surviving emotionally that they no longer know what it means to feel free. Free to disappoint people, free to speak honestly, free to stop rescuing everyone, free to admit exhaustion, free to choose themselves without guilt, because guilt became the emotional punishment for self-preservation. The moment they prioritize themselves, an old fear awakens. What if love disappears? So they continue abandoning themselves to maintain connection. But every act of self-betrayal leaves another invisible wound. Every forced smile when the soul is aching, every swallowed truth, every boundary ignored, every moment of emotional self-erasure. And eventually, the deepest pain is not what others did to them. It is realizing how long they participated in their own disappearance. Because many empaths were never taught that their emotions deserve the same compassion they offer everyone else. They were taught to manage themselves, control themselves, silence themselves, shrink themselves. And over time, they become me, emotionally available to the world while emotionally absent from themselves. But there comes a moment in healing when the exhausted soul can no longer survive on suppression, when the body begins to protest, when relationships begin to feel unbearable, when loneliness becomes louder than distraction, when the inner child who carried pain in silence for years finally whispers, "Can someone please listen to me now?" For many deeply sensitive people, compassion became a way of life long before it ever became a conscious choice. They learned to understand others before they ever understood themselves. They learned to forgive quickly, to listen deeply, to carry quietly. They became safe places for wounded people while secretly remaining unsafe within their own inner world. And for years they believed this was love. They believed love meant sacrifice. Love meant endurance. Love meant staying soft no matter how hard the world became. Love meant giving people endless chances while denying themselves even the smallest mercy. But there is a painful truth many empaths eventually discover. Compassion that excludes the self eventually becomes self-destruction, because no human being can endlessly pour from an abandoned soul. Many sensitive people know how to sit beside another person's suffering without judgment. They know how to comfort trembling hearts, how to calm fear, how to offer patience to broken people. But when they look at themselves, the voice changes completely. Suddenly there is criticism, shame, pressure. impossible expectations. They forgive others for being human while punishing themselves for the very same humanity. And this contradiction slowly exhausts the spirit, because the empath often becomes the one person they never learn how to love gently. They know how to say to others, "You're doing your best. You deserve rest. You matter too." But inside themselves lives a completely different conversation. "You should be stronger. You're too sensitive. Do more. Don't disappoint anyone." And beneath all of it is an old survival wound that whispers, "If you stop being useful, you may stop being loved." So they continue overgiving, overfunctioning, overcaring, overunderstanding, even when their body is exhausted, even when their soul is starving. Because somewhere in childhood, many empaths learned that compassion toward themselves was selfish. Maybe they were taught to suppress their needs because others had bigger problems. Maybe they were praised only when they were helpful, easy, and emotionally convenient. Maybe they became caretakers in environments where no one cared for them emotionally, and so self-neglect became normal. They became adults who instinctively show up for everyone else while disappearing from themselves. The tragedy is that many empaths can recognize pain everywhere except within their own hearts. They can sense emotional shifts in strangers, but they ignore their own burnout. They can immediately, dietly comfort a grieving friend, but they speak to themselves with cruelty when they are hurting. They can understand why others struggle, but they feel ashamed for struggling themselves. Because deep down, many sensitive people carry a hidden belief that their worth is measured by how much they can endure silently. And this belief creates lives built on emotional self-abandonment. There are people who have spent decades being everyone's safe place while never once feeling safe inside themselves. People who know how to rescue everyone except the exhausted person staring back at them in the mirror. And eventually, the soul begins to break under the weight of this imbalance, because compassion was never meant to be one-directional. Real compassion does not demand self-erasure. Real compassion does not require suffering to prove love. Real compassion does not ask someone to abandon their own humanity in order to care for others. Healing begins the moment an empath realizes they are not only the giver of compassion, they're also deserving of it. And for many people, this realization feels terrifying at first, because self-compassion requires something they were never taught to do: to stop, to listen inwardly, to acknowledge pain they spend years minimizing. It means admitting, "I am tired too, I have wounds too. I cannot continue carrying everyone while abandoning myself." And for someone conditioned to prioritize everyone else's emotions, this can feel almost unbearable. The empath often fears that choosing themselves will make them selfish, that setting boundaries will make them cruel, that saying no will make them unlovable, because their nervous system was trained to associate self-sacrifice with connection. But healing changes this understanding completely. Healing teaches that boundaries are not punishment, they are protection. Healing teaches that saying no is not rejection, it is honesty. Healing teaches that rest is not laziness, it is repair. And perhaps, most importantly, healing teaches that compassion toward the self is not weakness, it is the beginning of wholeness. Because the wounded empath often spends years waiting for someone else to finally choose them, to finally understand them, to finally care for them the way they care for others. But one of the deepest turning points in healing comes when they realize they must stop waiting for external permission to matter. They must become the person who finally listens to their own pain, the person who finally says, "You do not need to earn your right to exist." And this changes everything, because the moment self-compassion begins, the entire inner world starts to shift. The empath no longer feels responsible for fixing everyone, no longer confuses being needed with being loved, no longer stays in spaces that consume them emotionally. They begin recognizing the difference between helping and self-destruction. And perhaps for the first time in their lives, they begin asking a revolute, binary question: what do I need? Not what others expect, not what keeps everyone comfortable, not what prevents conflict, but what genuinely nourishes their own spirit. And this question can awaken enormous grief, because many empaths realize they spent years betraying themselves in order to preserve relationships, years apologizing for their sensitivity, years silencing their truth to avoid rejection, years carrying emotional burdens that never belonged to them. But grief is not failure. Grief is often the doorway back to the self, because healing is not becoming someone new. Healing is recovering the parts of yourself you had to abandon in order to survive. The playful self, the honest self, the rested self, the emotionally authentic self, The self that existed before fear taught you that love required self-sacrifice. And slowly, compassion begins turning inward. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gently. The empath begins speaking to themselves with the same tenderness they once served only for others. They stop calling themselves weak for feeling deeply. They stop apologizing for needing space. They stop measuring their worth by how much pain they can tolerate. And perhaps for the first time, they begin understanding this truth deep in their body. The ability to care for others was never the problem. The wound was believing they themselves were unworthy of the very compassion they gave so freely away.